she sat alone at the wedding. Until a millionaire whispered, "Pretend you're with me." Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The ballroom glittered with golden light as the string quartet played a soft waltz. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above the crowd of well-dressed guests, and laughter echoed between marble pillars. At the center of it all, couples danced, families toasted, and photographers rushed to capture every polished smile. Yet at the far end of the room, tucked into the last row of tables, sat a young woman who did not belong. Her name was Claire Dawson. She wore a simple navy dress, one she had borrowed from a friend, and her shoes pinched her feet because they were a size too small. She had been invited only because her distant cousin had married into the wealthy Whitmore family. And Claire had nowhere else to go on that chilly autumn night. She sat quietly, hands wrapped around a glass of water, her plate untouched, as waiters carried trays of champagne around her. Everywhere she looked, she saw luxury. Gowns worth more than her annual rent, men in tailored tuxedos, diamond jewelry glittering like ice. It made her shrink further into her chair. She had spent the last week searching for work after being let go from a diner. Her savings had almost vanished, and her landlord had already taped a warning notice to her apartment door. Sitting in this ballroom felt like sitting inside a cruel joke. Then, as she lowered her gaze to avoid another curious stare, a shadow fell across her table. A tall man leaned close, his tuxedo perfectly cut, his dark hair gleaming under the lights. His voice was low, smooth, and unexpected. "Pretend you are with me," he whispered. Claire blinked in shock, her heart racing. Before she could answer, he straightened, smiling warmly, as if they had always known each other. Guests turned their heads, assuming she was his date. He slipped into the chair beside her with effortless confidence, laying his hand lightly over hers. "Follow my lead," he murmured. She swallowed hard. "Why me?" she whispered back, her voice trembling. His eyes flicked toward the center of the ballroom, where an older woman with sharp eyes was watching him like a hawk. "Because if I show up alone, my aunt will not let me leave this night alive. You just saved me." Claire almost laughed at the absurdity, but the seriousness in his gaze silenced her. She looked down at his hand covering hers, strong and steady, and felt the weight of her own loneliness. For a brief second, she thought, what would it hurt to play along? As the music swelled, he rose and offered his hand. "Dance with me. Make it look real." Her pulse pounded in her ears. Against every instinct, Claire placed her hand in his. The room blurred around her as he led her onto the dance floor. His touch was firm, guiding, and his eyes never left hers. She had not danced in years, but somehow he made it easy, as though the two of them were the only people in the room. "Who are you really?" she asked in a hushed voice. He smiled faintly. "Tonight, I am your partner. That is all that matters." But Claire felt the weight of something unspoken in his words. She did not know yet that this stranger was far more than a charming man in a tuxedo. She did not know that behind the mask of ease and confidence was one of the most powerful millionaires in the city. And this dance, this lie they told together under the chandeliers, was the first step into a storm neither of them could escape. As the song ended and applause rippled through the ballroom, the man tightened his grip gently on her hand. "Stay with me," he whispered, his tone carrying both a plea and a command. And though every part of Claire wanted to flee back into the shadows, she found herself nodding. At that moment, she could not have imagined how pretending to be his companion at one wedding would unravel into a contract, a scandal, and a love story that would change her life forever. The music faded and Claire stepped back, her heart still hammering from the dance. The stranger guided her toward the side of the ballroom, keeping his hand lightly at her back. Guests whispered, watching them, and Claire realized every eye in the room now believed they belonged together. It was dizzying, unreal, and strangely terrifying. He leaned close again, his voice calm but firm. "Stay beside me a little longer. It will help us both." Claire wanted to protest, but then she saw the older woman who had been glaring across the room. Her expression had softened now, satisfied by the sight of them together. Claire suddenly understood this man had needed her as much as she had needed someone to notice her. Minutes later, he guided her out through the carved oak doors into the quiet marble hallway. Away from the music, his confidence faltered just enough to reveal a hint of weariness. He extended his hand properly this time. "I owe you an introduction. My name is Alexander Reid." The name struck her. She had heard it before, whispered in business news and gossip columns. Alexander Reid was the youngest heir of the Reid financial empire, a man written about in magazines she sometimes flipped through while waiting tables at the diner. But standing here, he looked more human than legend. Claire hesitated before placing her hand in his. "Claire Dawson," she answered softly. Alexander's eyes flicked down to her worn shoes, then back up to her flushed face. There was no judgment in his gaze, only curiosity. "You were sitting alone. You looked honest. That is why I chose you." She almost laughed at the absurdity, but her throat tightened instead. "I am no one important. Why pretend with me?" "Because," he said quietly, "sometimes the people who are no one to society are the only ones worth trusting." For a moment the words settled between them, heavier than the marble columns that surrounded them. Claire wanted to walk away, to escape this dangerous new world, but she could not move. There was something magnetic about him, something that made her want to stay. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, Alexander reached into his inner jacket pocket and drew out a folded document. He pressed it into her hand. "Read this when you are alone. It may sound outrageous, but I believe you will understand." Confused, Claire tucked the paper into her clutch. Before she could question him, another guest approached, calling his name. Alexander gave her a final look, one that promised their story was only beginning, and disappeared back into the glittering ballroom. That night, long after the wedding had ended, Claire sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment. The borrowed dress hung over the chair, her shoes tossed aside. She unfolded the document with trembling fingers. It was a contract, a marriage agreement. Her eyes widened as she scanned the lines. Alexander Reid proposed a temporary marriage arrangement. He would erase her debts, provide housing, and ensure her mother's medical care. In return, she would accompany him to family gatherings, public events, and play the role of his wife until his board of directors approved a pending merger. No intimacy, no obligations beyond appearances, and a generous sum deposited into her account each month. Claire's stomach twisted. It was insane. It was humiliating. And yet, it was everything she desperately needed. Rent was overdue. Her job was gone. Her mother's prescriptions sat unpaid at the pharmacy. Her pride screamed to tear the paper apart, but her heart whispered of the hope this deal could bring. As the city lights flickered through her window, Claire whispered to herself, "What have I gotten into?" She did not know that this single choice, whether to sign or to walk away, would lead her into the greatest conflict of her life. The line between pretending and truly loving would blur, and every truth she thought she knew would be tested. For now, she folded the contract and placed it beside her sketchbook, her mind restless. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, a storm had already begun. Claire barely slept that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling of her tiny apartment while the words of the contract repeated in her mind. Marriage by arrangement, a life she could not imagine, tied to a man she had only just met. By dawn, exhaustion pressed heavily on her, but the thought of her mother's medicine and the eviction notice on her door pushed harder. When the morning light crept through the blinds, she made her decision. She would meet Alexander Reid again, if only to hear his explanation. That afternoon, she returned to the address listed at the bottom of the contract. The car ride itself felt unreal. The taxi driver whistled low when he stopped at the gates of a sprawling estate on the edge of the city. Wrought iron gates swung open to reveal a mansion that looked more like a museum, with tall white columns and immaculate gardens stretching in every direction. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Inside, the marble floors gleamed, and chandeliers lit every corridor. A housekeeper led her to a sunlit parlor where Alexander was waiting. He stood by the window, his posture straight, his expression calm. When she entered, he turned, his eyes steady on hers. "You came," he said simply. "I had to," she admitted, clutching her purse. "I read the contract. It feels insane. Why would you want this with me, a stranger?" Alexander walked closer, his voice low and deliberate. Because I do not need a partner who plays games. I need someone who will not betray me. At the wedding, I saw how you looked at me. Not with calculation. Not with greed. Just like a person. That is rare in my world. Claire felt heat rise to her cheeks. So you want me to marry you? To pretend? Because I am ordinary? Because you are honest, he corrected softly. And honesty is the one thing money cannot buy. Silence stretched. Claire looked down at the contract, still clutched in her hand. Her pride rebelled, but the image of her mother coughing in their small apartment weighed heavier. Finally she whispered, "What are the terms again?" Alexander's eyes softened, but his tone remained firm. "This is a partnership. Appearances only. You will accompany me to 5 major events over the next 3 months. You will live here at the estate, so the arrangement appears convincing. I will settle your debts, secure proper medical care for your mother, and ensure your stability. There will be boundaries. No intimacy, no invasion of private life. We sign, and we both get what we need." Claire's hands shook as she set the paper on the polished table. She looked him in the eye. "And if I refuse? Then you walk out that door," Alexander said evenly, "and I will not stop you. But you return to your world as it is now. Debts, eviction, and unanswered phone calls from doctors. I am offering you a chance to breathe, Claire. Nothing more, nothing less." Her chest tightened. It felt like a trap, yet also like a lifeline. She picked up the pen lying on the table. Her hand hovered, trembling. Then, with a deep breath, she signed her name. When the ink dried, Alexander reached for the document, his expression unreadable. He extended his hand to her once more, but this time it was not just for introduction. "Welcome to your new life, Mrs. Reid." The words made her stomach twist. She was not his wife in any real sense, yet the weight of that title settled heavily on her shoulders. Later that evening, she stood at the tall windows of the guest suite assigned to her. The room was more luxurious than anything she had ever known. Silk curtains, a bed large enough for 3, and a view of gardens glowing under moonlight. But despite the beauty, Claire felt small and out of place, like a borrowed piece in someone else's world. From the hallway came the muffled sound of footsteps. She glanced at the closed door, her heart skipping. This house, this contract, this new identity, it was all too much. She pressed her hand against the glass and whispered to herself, "What have I done?" Downstairs, Alexander Reid poured a glass of scotch and stared out at the same moonlit gardens. His face, composed as ever, betrayed only a flicker of thought. He had made business deals worth millions, but never one that unsettled him quite like this. Both of them knew the contract was only the beginning. Neither could see yet how quickly pretending would blur into something real, something dangerous, and something that would change them forever. The first days inside the Reid estate felt like stepping into a dream Claire did not trust. The house was so vast she sometimes lost her way from the grand staircase to the dining hall. Polished silver gleamed on the long tables, paintings worth more than her yearly rent lined the halls, and staff members moved silently in the background, their eyes curious but careful. On the second evening, she was summoned to dinner. The dining table stretched almost the length of a basketball court, its polished wood shining under chandeliers. Alexander sat at the far end, dressed in a crisp white shirt, his jacket draped neatly over the chair. A chef presented course after course, dishes Claire had only ever seen on television. She sat stiffly, cutting into the delicate food, feeling like an imposter. Finally, she whispered, "I am not sure I belong here." Alexander looked at her calmly across the long distance of the table. "You signed the contract. That makes you part of this house." Claire set her fork down. "A contract does not make me one of you. It makes me a prop." His eyes darkened slightly, but instead of anger, there was something else. Weariness. "Do you think I want this either? This entire arrangement exists because every person in my life is watching. They demand stability, a family image, a wife at my side. You are here to fill that gap, and in return, you get what you need, nothing more." Her throat tightened at the bluntness of his words. She wanted to shout at him, to tell him how degrading it felt, but the truth was carved into her reality. Her mother's medicine was already delivered, her rent notice quietly erased. She was trapped between gratitude and humiliation. After dinner, Alexander walked her through the estate, introducing her to the areas where she might need to appear. The gallery hall, the library, the sunlit terrace overlooking the gardens. At each stop he explained quietly, like a man preparing her for a test. When guests come, you stand here. You smile at them here. You hold my arm when I introduce you. Claire listened, her face pale. She felt less like a partner, and more like an actress rehearsing lines. Still, she nodded, whispering only once, "I will try not to embarrass you." Alexander paused at the terrace doors, his hand resting on the frame. He turned to her, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "It is not about embarrassment, Claire. It is about survival. For both of us." That night she returned to her suite, sinking into the enormous bed, the silk sheets cool against her skin. But no matter how soft the room, loneliness pressed heavily over her. She missed the hum of the city outside her tiny apartment window, the sound of neighbors' voices through the thin walls, even the comfort of her second-hand blanket. Luxury felt like a cage. The following week blurred into lessons. A stylist arrived with racks of gowns, teaching her which colors suited her best. A tutor coached her on etiquette, how to hold her glass, how to greet investors, how to step out of a limousine with grace. Claire stumbled, fumbled, laughed nervously when she tripped on the hem of a dress. Yet, beneath the embarrassment, something in her shifted. She began to hold herself taller, to walk with steadier steps. Alexander watched quietly from a distance, arms crossed, saying little. But sometimes, just sometimes, Claire caught a flicker of something softer in his eyes when she made progress. One afternoon, as she practiced walking down the marble staircase in heels that pinched her toes, she stumbled badly. Her ankle twisted, and she braced herself for the crash. But a hand caught her waist firmly, steadying her. Alexander stood close, his grip protective, his voice low. "Careful, the cameras will not forgive you, but I will not let you fall." Her breath caught. For a brief second, the air between them shifted. The world outside the contracts, the obligations, the rehearsals fell away. It was just her and him, too close, too real. Claire pulled back quickly, her cheeks burning. "Thank you," she whispered. Alexander released her, his mask sliding back into place. "You are improving," he said almost gruffly. That evening, she wrote in her sketchbook, the only piece of her old life she had brought into the estate. She drew the outline of the staircase, the curve of his hand at her waist. She told herself it was only practice, only to pass the time. But as the lines took shape, she realized the truth she was afraid to admit. Pretending was becoming harder with every passing day. And in the quiet of the grand estate, Claire Dawson began to feel the first stirrings of something she had sworn she would never allow herself. Something dangerously close to love. The days after the gala carried a different weight between Claire and Alexander. The contract still bound them, the rules still written clearly on paper, but something invisible had shifted. She felt it in the way he looked at her, not as a stranger wearing borrowed gowns, but as if she were someone he was beginning to see. One evening, rain swept across the city. The estate felt colder, the storm rattling against tall windows. Claire wandered into the library, rows of leather-bound books stretching endlessly, the scent of old paper filling the air. She found Alexander sitting alone by the fire, a glass untouched at his side, staring into the flames. "You are quiet tonight," she said softly. He did not look up immediately. When he did, his voice was low, almost fragile. "My father built everything you see, the company, the estate, the image. He taught me never to show weakness, never to trust anyone. And yet, even he could not survive the loneliness of this world." Claire sat across from him, her heart tugging. "Is that why you needed this contract? To make the loneliness disappear, even if it is only pretend?" Alexander's jaw tightened. For a moment he looked as though he might push her away with words sharper than glass. But then he sighed, the firelight flickering across his face. "Pretend has been safer than real. Real costs too much." The silence stretched, heavy with truths unsaid. Claire wanted to tell him that she understood, that her own life had been built on sacrifices and masks. Instead, she reached for the sketchbook she had begun filling again. She flipped it open to a page where she had drawn the grand staircase, the outline of his hand steadying her when she almost fell. "I am not from your world," she said quietly, "but I know what it means to be afraid of falling. Maybe we both need something real, even if it terrifies us." Alexander's gaze dropped to the sketch, and something flickered in his eyes, surprise, then softness. He closed the book gently and handed it back. "You are braver than you think, Claire." Thunder cracked outside, making the windows tremble. For the first time, Alexander smiled faintly, unguarded, almost boyish. And for the first time, Claire felt her chest ache with something more than fear. Later, as she returned to her suite, she pressed her palm to her heart. This was not the life she had chosen, but it was the life she was living. Somewhere, between the lies of their contract and the truth of their moments together, something had begun to grow. She whispered into the quiet, "What happens when pretending is not enough anymore?" The storm outside raged on, but inside the Reid estate, a different storm was only just beginning. The warmth of those quiet nights did not last. As soon as whispers about Alexander and Claire reached the wider circle of his family and business rivals, the storm that had been waiting finally struck. It began at a luncheon hosted by one of the Reid family's oldest allies. Claire arrived on Alexander's arm, dressed in a pale gown that the stylist had chosen, trying to hide her nerves behind a polite smile. The room glittered with silver cutlery and cold eyes. Conversations hushed the moment they entered, then swelled again, with murmurs she could not quite hear. As the luncheon unfolded, an older cousin of Alexander's rose to speak, his tone dripping with false cheer. "It seems our Alexander has found himself a bride," he announced loudly, drawing every gaze toward them. "But tell us, Claire, what exactly did you do before stepping into this world of marble and chandeliers? Surely you were not born into it." The question cut like a knife. Claire's throat tightened as faces leaned in, waiting for her to stumble. She opened her mouth, but the words tangled on her tongue. She wanted to say she had worked honestly, that she had fought every day to survive, but humiliation threatened to choke her. Alexander's hand tightened around hers beneath the table. He spoke before she could. "Her past is none of your concern," he said coolly, his voice edged with steel. "What matters is that she is here now, with me, and if anyone doubts her place at my side, then they doubt me." The room went silent. But the damage was already done. Claire felt the sting of every stare, every whisper she knew would follow. That night, after they returned to the estate, she pulled away from Alexander in the marble foyer. "This was a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "I should never have signed that contract. I do not belong in your world. They see me as a fraud, and maybe they are right." Alexander stepped closer, his jaw tight. "Do not say that. They try to break anyone who stands near me. It is not you they despise, Claire. It is me, and the fear of what they cannot control." But she shook her head, tears threatening. "You defended me in front of them, but it only made things worse. I am drowning in a lie I cannot live." The words hung between them like shattered glass. For the first time, Claire saw anger flash in his eyes, not at her, but at the walls closing in around them. "This was supposed to protect us both," he muttered, almost to himself. Claire turned away, her chest heavy. She climbed the grand staircase alone, her steps echoing in the empty hall. For the first time since signing the contract, she felt not like a partner, not even like a prop, but like a prisoner. Upstairs in her suite, she pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window. She whispered to herself, "This is not love, this is survival, and I cannot tell the difference anymore." Downstairs, Alexander poured himself another drink, his reflection staring back at him from the crystal glass. For the first time, he questioned not just the contract, but his own heart. And somewhere deep inside, both of them knew the fragile illusion they had built was beginning to crack. The days that followed were filled with silence. Claire kept to her suite, avoiding the marble halls that had once felt like a stage for her rehearsals. Alexander buried himself in meetings, returning late, his footsteps echoing through the estate long after midnight. The distance between them grew heavier with every passing day, until it became a wall neither dared to cross. But whispers in the city did not fade. Instead, they sharpened. A rival within the Reid company seized the moment, feeding rumors to the press. Headlines began to appear, stories questioning Claire's past, suggesting she had trapped Alexander for his fortune. Photographers camped outside the gates, and gossip spread like fire. One evening, as Claire stood on the terrace watching flashes of cameras beyond the gates, Alexander joined her. His expression was carved from stone, but his voice carried exhaustion. "They have taken the bait. They believe you are a gold digger. They want me humiliated, and they are using you to do it." "Oh?" Her chest tightened. "Then release me. End this contract before they destroy us both." Alexander turned sharply, his eyes burning with frustration. "Do you think ending it would silence them?" "They would drag your name through the mud, Claire. They would call you a liar, a fraud, and I would not be able to stop them." Tears stung her eyes, but she forced her voice steady. "So, what do we do?" For the first time, his shoulders sagged as though the weight of his empire pressed down too hard. Then, slowly, his hand closed around hers. "We fight. Not with more lies, but with the truth." Claire blinked at him, unsure. "What truth?" Alexander hesitated, then let out a breath he had been holding for years. "That I am tired of living behind contracts. That I am tired of pretending. If they want to see us as real, then we will give them real. No more distance. No more charade." Her heart pounded. The lines between acting and reality blurred until she could not tell where the performance ended and her own feelings began. She whispered, "Do you mean that?" His gaze softened, and for the first time it was not the mask of a businessman or an heir, but simply a man standing vulnerable before her. "Yes, I do." The storm outside the gates still raged with cameras and headlines, but on the terrace, something shifted. Claire felt the fragile wall between them begin to crumble. Alexander lifted her hand, pressing it gently to his chest. "If we are to fall, then let us fall together. But if we stand as more than a contract." For the first time since that fateful wedding night, Claire allowed herself to believe it might be possible. She nodded slowly, whispering through trembling lips, "Then let us stand." In that moment, under the glow of the terrace lights, the battle lines were drawn. Not against each other, but against the world that wanted them apart. And as Alexander held her hand tightly, Claire knew the choice ahead was no longer about survival. It was about love, truth, and the courage to claim both. The turning point came on the night of the foundation gala. The ballroom glittered once again, filled with the city's most powerful faces. But this time, Claire did not sit quietly at the edges. She walked beside Alexander, her hand steady on his arm, her head held high. The rumors still swirled, the whispers still hissed. But she no longer felt like an imposter. As speeches began, Alexander took the stage. His voice carried through the hall with calm authority. "Many of you have doubted the woman at my side," he said, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. "You have questioned her past, her worth, and even my judgment. But tonight, I will tell you the truth. Claire Dawson is not here because of a contract. She is here because of her courage, her honesty, and because she has given me what wealth never could trust." Gasps rippled through the audience. Cameras flashed. Claire's heart pounded as Alexander turned to her in front of them all. From his pocket, he drew not the cold paper of a contract, but a velvet box. He opened it to reveal a simple, elegant ring. "The first agreement between us was written in ink," he said, his voice steady. "But this time, I ask for something real. No signatures, no conditions, no deadlines. Only love. Claire, will you marry me, not as an arrangement, but as the truth of my life?" For a moment the room seemed to freeze. Claire's eyes filled with tears. All the doubt, the humiliation, the long nights alone in her borrowed suite, it all rose in her chest. But so did the memory of his hand catching her when she stumbled, his voice defending her against cruelty, his gaze when he finally dropped his mask. She whispered, "Yes." "Oh!" Applause erupted, filling the hall with thunder. But for Claire, there was only the warmth of his hand slipping the ring onto her finger and the certainty that the pretense was finally over. Weeks later, their wedding was nothing like the lavish displays she had once imagined from magazines. It was small, held in the estate's garden under strings of lights. There were no reporters, no critics, only a handful of people who truly mattered. Claire wore a gown she had chosen herself, simple but radiant, and Alexander stood waiting with eyes that held no secrets. When they exchanged vows, Claire felt as if the world beyond the garden no longer existed. There was no contract to bind them, no lie to protect them, only the promise they spoke aloud, fragile and unbreakable. After the ceremony, as music played softly and laughter drifted under the night sky, Alexander drew her close. "Do you regret the mistake that began it all?" he asked, his smile touched with irony. Claire shook her head, tears glistening as she laughed. "It was the best mistake I ever made." And as he kissed her under the glow of the lights, Claire realized that the story which began with a whisper at a wedding had ended with a vow of forever. Not survival, not pretense, but love real, unshakable, and entirely their own.